Welcome to part one of The Dead Have No Need of Ethics. And the way I started off this section is by basically defining the terms again. What is ethics? What is morality? Someone want to tell me what ethics means again? Give me some new voices. My quiet
Theory of right conduct.
Thank you. Theory of right conduct and morality. What's morality?
It's the practice of ethics.
All right. Putting into practice your ethic. Now, before we get into the theory and the practice, we get to talk about metaethics. And meta is one of those prefixes which can mean above or beyond. So we're going to start talking big categories, metaethics, and then we're going to work down to particular ethical issues and dilemmas. So starting off, metaethics is going to ask questions like, is ethics even possible? Can humans actually know how to live correctly? That's the first question. What do you guys think? Do any of you think you can actually tell me the difference between right and wrong, between good and evil?
Well, if I default to my ethic of following the Bible and following Christ, he's told me a good deal of what is right and what is wrong.
Okay, but do you know that that is correct, or do you believe that that's correct? And I'm doing that one more pitch for my epistemology apologetics class that meets on Monday, Wednesdays at 2. You still can join us if you want. We've been discussing, one of the first things I had them discuss with me is what is the difference between belief and knowledge? And what I'm asking you,
man's laws and
not
God's
do you
laws.
believe what is, some things are good and believe other things are bad, but do you know if some things are good and other things are evil? Go ahead, Brian.
I was just saying that something I've always tried to live by or know is man's laws and God's laws. So you know you're doing something right if you're obeying man's laws and God's laws. I mean, maybe way off topic, but
It's not, but
I
how
feel
do
like-
you know what God's laws are?
yeah, well, follow Jesus, I guess.
That's always the right answer at an evangelical college, right? Jesus. The answer is Jesus, Blackburn.
It's always Jesus.
But I'm going to hold you to something a little more than that today. What's the difference between believing and knowing? I think we had like a 45-minute discussion on this in my epistemology class. We won't do that in here today, but
Well, wouldn't that be faith?
what about faith? What is faith?
Well, the difference between knowing and believing, I guess. I don't know, maybe not.
Faith would probably fall under the believing category, but then you get people like philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard who believe that faith is the most sure way of knowing, which is quite a paradox, because at least how Scripture defines faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Not normally how we define knowledge,
Yeah.
at least not in a Western culture.
Right.
Let me see if this helps you. I only know like 3 things, but I believe thousands of things.
What are
So then
those
you're
things
working with it.
What's that?
What are those 3 things that you know?
I know that I exist. And you might say, do you really, Blackburn? And I'm giving credit to Descartes on this one, because if you're familiar with his cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, he was trying to deconstruct all the different ways of knowing things. And we're going to do that in just a minute here. I have a little list generated. It's in the book. And oh, I forgot to bring up my my digital version. Maybe I can do that in a minute. But anyways, we go through all these different ways that we believe we can know things, and then we look at the problems that occurs with them. But after all this process of deconstructing our senses, our reason, authority, revelation, all these different ways humans believe we can know things about the world, when all the dust settles, it really comes down to, how do we know if we're being told the truth or if we're being deceived? Descartes went so far to realize he doesn't even know if he's dreaming or awake. So trip on that for a minute. When I work a lot, I actually dream about my work. It like continues into my dreamscape. And it's always shocking to me when I wake up from a dream, and some dreams are so real, I'm a little disconcerted, because how do I know now if I'm awake or I've just awoken within a dream? Have you ever had those double or triple dreams? It's kind of like Inception. It's so freaky.
Yeah.
You wake up and you go, whoo! Thank you, Jesus. My only way out was if this was a dream, but you're still in a dream. And what Descartes came to realize was, whether he's thinking clearly or being deceived, whether he's dreaming or awake, there is still a him that is thinking. Now, it may be a him that's thinking incorrectly, but at least he knows there's a him or a person as long as he's thinking.
But couldn't a person say, like, if the most happiness one felt was when they were dreaming and they had like a simultaneous, like back-to-back dreams like that, and they felt the pain when they were alive, so they try to like make a whole transition and try to just and force their mind to believe that, like, when they're sleeping, that's when they are like alive and aware. But then when they wake up from it, that's when they're dreaming, because it's not, because that's a nightmare. You know what I'm saying? Can that be like? Yeah.
I never heard it reversed like that, but that's interesting.
Isn't that just the Matrix?
It kind of.
Yeah, it's like.
But
sorry.
In a lot of ways, I kind of think that's how it's going to be for us. We're going to wake up one day into reality. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Okay. Anyways, so knowledge, I'm looking for much stricter criteria, verifiable, absolute, universal truth. And if I know that I exist because I'm a thing that thinks, now that doesn't mean I know I have a body. It doesn't mean there's an external world. All I know is I'm a thing that thinks. For all I know, I'm a mind in a vat somewhere, But there are certain things I realize, because when I think about being a thing that thinks, it means that I can know things. So that's two things. I know I exist, and I know that I can know things, that's two things, which means I'm a thinking thing that can know things. And one of the things I know is that I can know multiple things. There's my three things. It just gets silly after that. Everything else is belief. I live by belief. I did have one very high-end student challenge me even on the premise that I know that I exist. He said, but Blackburn, what if you're just a computer program that was programmed to think that you think? And I don't know that I have a real good answer for that. But even then, I would say, but I would still exist because I was a thing that was programmed to think. So there's still a me that was programmed. I think Descartes still works, but I'm still working out the details. Okay. Moving right along. That being said, it kind of answers my first question. Do you really think you can tell the difference between good and evil, right and wrong? And I would say you can believe it, that you know, But to say that you know, I would have to challenge you mightily.
I think you could think what you've done was evil, but then it could transform into something good based off other people's reactions to what you did.
Mhm.
Like, say somebody did something they had to do to keep their lights on or pay a bill or something like that, and he had to provide for a family, and it wasn't morally or like it wasn't like Christianly ethic, but then you see what you did and the response that your family gave you and how like the smiles upon their face and stuff like that could transform into what you think is good. But at the same time, that could be toxic, because when you keep on getting rewarded for that behavior, that's when you get spiral. It's all depend. Like, it's a whole trip.
Right.
One semi-good thing leads to some semi-bad. So,
Right. So with this idea of goodness, I'm going to give you a big philosophic sentence and see if you can unpack it for me. I do not believe humans are in the epistemic position to know the difference between good and evil. Do you remember what that big word epistemic means?
So epistemic means your cognitive faculties, like your ability to know something.
Right. It's the philosophic discipline of theory of knowledge, like how do we know things? And what I'm saying in that sentence, we're not in an epistemic position to know the difference between good and evil. I do not believe as subjective human beings, we can step out of our point of view. But in order to know absolute universal good and evil, you have to be outside of all of it in order to see all the mitigating factors, all the cause and effect from the beginning to the end. And I only know one being that is in that perspectival position. And I ain't it.
So two things then. Since
Why are
God
we
commanded
doing
not,
this class? Is that the first question?
no. So if God commanded Adam not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, it could be argued that man was never intended to know good and evil from the beginning.
That passage is so weird though, Dominique.
Second, go ahead.
Because it said Eve looked on the tree and saw that it was good.
Right, prior to knowing.
Before she even ate of it.
And she was wrong though, so.
Well, she was correct in that it looked good for food and was pleasant to the eyes. That's true.
Yeah.
The tree itself wasn't the problem, though. The tree itself wasn't evil. Is it the tree that was evil, or the action of her rebelling against God that was
No,
the problem?
the tree wasn't evil. The tree
Exactly.
fruit
Itself was
contained
just
the
a thing,
knowledge
yeah.
of good and evil.
Exactly.
Yeah, but the designation tree of good and evil has to mean something. It does modify the tree in some sense.
Right. So what kind of knowledge did they gain from eating of that fruit that they wouldn't have had before?
Well,
It's
one,
good.
they grew in their shame, they grew in their sin, they grew in more ways to do evil and their inability to do good. So even if they had them, couldn't out quickly, couldn't be well.
First of all, I would say that type of good, unfortunately in Hebrew, like in English, we have that one word good that can mean everything from God is good to that was a good cheeseburger. And I think the type of usage when Eve said that that was good, it was kind of like how your pet dog or cat may think this is good pet food and that's bad cat food. It's more like a taste or a personal. I don't think Eve was thinking in these abstract categories of good and evil. I think it was much more innocent, primitive, almost animalistic in a sense. I mean, very high end, rational, but no experience, right? None of that to go with those categories. What I think happened with the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, humans were actually given these abstract metaphysical categories of good and evil, but without God's perspective. So now you have humans with these categories of right and wrong, good and evil, but they're making judgments based on their limited subjective human perspective. And I think that is exactly what we see in the history of mankind, where everyone seeks their own way. They seek what they think is good, try to avoid what they think is evil. But it's why we have so many different theories of ethics, so many different religions, so many different philosophies, so many different economic systems, because people are all approaching it from very little limited human perspective. But God not only has the categories of good and evil, but he has the knowledge to actually determine what those things are in an absolute universal way, where humans are limited to very subjective, personal claims of good and evil, right and wrong. Is that good? Okay, I won't beat this to death. You may think I did already, but that being said, I'm still going to teach this class anyways, because I think it's still of great value in understanding others and why they believe certain things are right and wrong, and understanding ourselves, why we believe certain things are right and wrong. But I want to get us in part 2 to something completely different. All right, so that first one is knowledge even, is the knowledge of good and evil even possible? The next question is, if we can actually know the difference between good and evil, we have the ability to do the good and reject the evil?
I would say no without the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, that's a quick no for me too. And Romans 1 kind of echoes that, and Romans 2, I believe, where Paul is talking about those who were given the law, and I believe he's talking about the law of Moses there, could not live up to the law of Moses. But those without the law of Moses had a law unto themselves. And I'm assuming he's talking about their own conscience or the way they were brought up in their own cultures or society. We all have an internal moral compass. But even those who weren't given the revealed law of God, like the Jews obviously couldn't live up to God's law. But even those who were just trying to live up to their own conscience can't do that. Everyone has fallen. No one is righteous, whether it be to the God standards or even to our limited human standards. None of us can live up to it. And so that's another big problem. Not only do I not believe we can know what good and evil is, but we don't have the power to do the good and reject the evil, even if we did have that knowledge.
I think
Now
we
you
can
might
do,
be thinking, why are we doing this class?
but like to what extent though? Because like over time, of course, we can't do it because eventually we fall. But you can do one thing that is good. All right, you can do one thing that is bad. You can't like
That's
up
not
to the
what God
standard of what?
It's not what God says.
No, I would disagree with that.
No, the scripture is quite clear that no one does good.
No, he says no one is good, not that they don't do good. Which one are you referencing?
He's referencing Romans 3, like 10 or something.
There is none righteous, no, not one.
Now, yes, you're not righteous, but that doesn't one
What
thing.
is
Even if you can do one
righteous
thing perfectly, doesn't make you righteous. Because we're not just one action. We are, we're a whole holistic view. That doesn't mean that you can't do a righteous thing.
I think it does, Elijah.
I don't think so. I think it's a stretch.
What does Isaiah say about our good works? What does he compare them to?
Filthy rags.
Filthy rags.
So yeah, he's referencing Romans 3:12. There's none who does good. So
I was actually thinking about the
It does say
passage
that.
of all we like sheep have gone astray, but I might be collaging there in my head. So thank you for it's great I'm being live fact checked while we're talking.
I think what clarifies what you're saying is that because the first part of what you said is we have to know good and evil to be able to do good and evil, right? So since our understanding of good and evil is wrong, we're doing good in our sense, but in God's sense, like you said, filthy rags. So
Thank
I
you.
get
That
where
was a
Dex-
necessary qualifier.
yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So metaethics is asking, can we know how to live correctly? If we can, how should we go about it? What enables us to do that? Along with a variety of questions. So it's asking these big open net questions. Now, the next rung down from that, I like how my formatter put in these black dividers between the chapters. It makes it easy to get there quickly. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about after the metaethics, if you see on page 41 of the hard copy, I have a list of how do we know things. I use sense perception, experience, reason, intuition, enculturation, and revelation. But then, as you can imagine, each one of those has very severe critiques of why they're problematic, right? Our senses deceive us. Our experiences may be true, but they're limited to us or perhaps even a past event. Reason is a wonderful tool, but it's also limited, and we can use it incorrectly, which I would call rationalization, using reason to justify things instead of trying to discern things. Enculturation, the way we're brought up. So much of what we believe is good or evil is simply how we were raised. Authority, because someone told you, and that could be anyone from your mama to your preacher to your ethics professor. And finally, revelation, information given to us that is beyond our reason or our life experiences. But once again, how do you know the revelation is true, or that you're not just making it up in your own head, or that you're not a false prophet or something? So revelation can be very tricky. Okay. Normative ethics. Oh, go ahead.
You said our senses deceive us, and you said, what did you say after that? Because of our experiences?
An existentialist, which is one of our 9 theories, existentialism, believes that you can only know what you've personally experienced. In fact, there's even a Greek word for that. I mean, the Greek word for knowledge is gnosis, but experiential knowledge is called epigenosko. It means something you have personally encountered. And from an existentialist perspective, all other types of knowledge is just hearsay. Like, for example, I could read a book about baking sourdough bread from scratch and making my own starters and all that, and I could have all the intellectual data. But an existentialist would say, until I actually personally experience making my own sourdough bread, it's just hearsay. I don't really epigenosko it until I do it or experience it. One more example. You may know a lot about junkies or addicts, but until you're actually a junkie or an addict, you do not epigenosko what that means. You may have an intellectual understanding of it, you may have an academic understanding, but until you're there in the gutter, you really don't know. That's the existential piece. But even then, I think in the book I use the example of eating sunflower seeds as a kid. I had a bad experience, but I used that experience to think I knew the causal effect of sunflower seeds and my tummy. But I could have had the flu. It could have been a bad batch of seeds. And I used that one experience, which was a real experience, and I projected that into all other sunflower seed experiences into the future. Silly.
Doesn't that like demonstrate then that what we say we know from experience is wrong? Like that goes along with the knowing nothing, basically. Like, because what you're saying is even in experience, then we can know things, or we can't know things until we experience it. But what if that experience is flawed?
Right? Even that type of knowledge, it's so limited, right? And it's so subjective. It's not that capital K type knowing I'm so desperately searching for. It's like a little K know. And if that's confusing to you in my book, I don't know if I made a little guide, but you'll notice the capitalizations change when I use words. So if you ever see me using capitals on these things, I'm talking about that high end. And if I'm using the lowercase, I'm just using it in common everyday usage. So hopefully that will help you as you're reading the book. Okay. Anyways, back to the big list. So we've got metaethics up here, and then we have what's called normative ethics. And normative ethics is where we find the theories, where different philosophers, theologians, other people have come up with ideas, sometimes psychologists even have come up with ideas of a theory of ethics, a theory of the right way to live. And that's what part one is going to be about. We are going to go through each of these major theories in the West, and I'm going to try to objectively describe them to you. I'm going to try to show their strengths and weaknesses to you, and then critique why I think it fails. And just a spoiler alert, by the time we get to the end of section 1, my conclusion is all ethical systems fail. And they all primarily fail because they are all human constructs. And because humans are fallible and faulty, we cannot come up with a capital T truth for ethics. And then finally, meta, normative, and then we get down to topics. And ethics can be applied to, I can't imagine one topic it can't be applied to under the sun. So we could talk about environmental ethics. We could talk about medical ethics. We could talk about business ethics. We could talk about counseling and confidentiality ethics. Anything you can imagine, we could apply ethics to. This theory of what is right and wrong behavior, the good, the better, the best. Okay, so part one, we're going to go through the normative, and then I'm going to give you something else in part 2. And then after we finish the book, we will move into the topics. And I'll give you plenty of time to tell me what topics you want to talk about. In the course catalog, it lists 9 contemporary issues, from abortion to environmental issues. Some of these topics, I still think they're important, but I am exhausted by them at this point in my life and career. But they're important, so I'm happy to talk about them if you want to. But I'd really rather talk about things that are happening right now that are affecting you or causing you confusion or concern in your own life or the people you know. So I want to cater it to where you guys are and what you're struggling with, not just these classic topics of debate. And we can do a mix of both. All right. Any questions on any of that so far? All right, I'm going to see if I can pull up my digital copy so we can go through this together. Just give me a moment. Should I open this up ahead of time? Yeah. Can you guys see the course text coming up?
We see your inbox or
Okay,
chat thing.
let me stop sharing, and now that I got it open, I can go back. Okay, see part 2 there? Yay, there we go. So formatting's not great here, but this is the chart I was referring to. So how do we know things? We talk about sense perception, and I gave you examples, or hopefully I'm not confusing this with my other class, but our senses are wonderful. It's the primary way in which I know things, but it's also quite limited. And it's subject to being deceived. I use a example in my last class of the graphic artist M.C. Escher, who is able to draw things on two-dimensional canvases that you could never make in a three-dimensional world. And I think that's really interesting how even this idea of things that are further away appear smaller, but the closer they get to us, they appear bigger. And so it's often that we misperceive, I don't want to say misperceive things. In fact, St. Augustine said our perceptions are always correct, which I was quite shocked to hear from St. Augustine. What he said the problem isn't the way we're perceiving, but it's our interpretation of our perceptions. That's where the error takes place, not in the perception itself. Any questions on that part? I'm trying to see how to switch. I got your image bar, and I don't know how to make it vertical again instead of horizontal. Oh, well, still learning. I'll move you guys down here. We talked a little bit about the experience piece. Reason, same thing. Reason is a great tool, but if you think about it yourself, have you ever been deceived or had faulty thinking or misused your reason? And I don't know of anyone who could claim their reason was never wrong or faulty, except maybe Immanuel Kant, but we'll get to him later. Intuition is like a direct knowing, where you didn't come through it through a rational process, and you didn't come through it necessarily through sense perception, but it's just like this direct, I know this is true, or this has to be right. And the problem, of course, is what happens if your intuition deceives you? Maybe you have a really great track record and your intuition is usually right, but have you ever really just believed or thought you knew something was true and then it turned out not to be true at all? And I've certainly encountered that. Enculturation, this is the belief that it is your society or your culture that teaches you what is true, what is false, what is real, what is fake, what is knowledge, what is ignorance. But once again, can cultures give you misinformation? Has your mama or your preacher or your teacher ever told you something that turned out not to be true? I know mine have, and they may not have meant it. They may have been taught false information, and they're just passing that on to the next generation over and over and over again. We talk about authority, especially in evangelical Christian circles. Many Christians will base truth on authority. whether that's the authority of spiritual leaders, pastors, teachers, whether that's the authority of theologians, whether that's the authority of the scriptures, or the authority of God himself. Once again, I would ask, has any authority in your life ever misled or deceived you? And
Yep.
I wish the answer was no, but I think you probably all would have to say yes at some level, some point. And then finally, revelation as a way of knowing. This is knowledge you're gaining that is outside of your reason or your personal experience. We often see this in religious traditions. It can come through signs, dreams, omens, visions, mystical states of consciousness. Even faith could be seen as a type of revelation. But once again, I would ask you, have you ever encountered a false prophet? Or have you ever thought something was true given by this sort of revealed knowledge that turned out not to be correct at all? And so that's just kind of a brief overview of ways of knowing and sort of the problems or limitations with those different aspects of the way we claim we have knowledge in our life. Any questions or comments on that quick list? All right.
So should we start with the hermeneutic of suspicion?
I would, but maybe that's just my temperament. Or because I've been deceived so many times, it does make me a bit more cautious. Oh, I see. I go through and I break down all those in the next section. All right. This is the exercise I was telling you about earlier, where in previous classes, I have asked my students to define what they mean by the word good. And this is part of what I'm asking you to do in that personal ethic, that kind of like pre-paper that you're going to use as a benchmark to compare at the end of class. And this is one of the lists generated by a former students of mine. Some would equate good with pleasure, some with self-interest. Others would say what your mama says or your culture says. Others would say good is God's will. Others would say what aligns with God's order or reason. Happiness, and not just happiness in general, but happiness for the most people. That which is in accordance with reason is good. That which is ignorance would be evil. That which is well balanced or proportioned is good, as opposed to that which is out of kilter. What is caring or loving, positive experiences. And so what I did in this next chart, I went through and I associated these definitions with different theories that we're going to cover in part one. So good being equal to pleasure would be the ethical theory called hedonism. One of my personal favorites. Pleasure is good, pain is evil. And be honest, isn't that the way most of us roll? We're trying to acquire things that are pleasurable, and we're trying to avoid things that cause pain and suffering, at least for ourselves. Self-interest, that is our first theory out of the book, and self-interest is called egoism. And quite simply, in a nutshell, what's good for me is good, what's bad for me is bad. And this is what I meant by telling you, if you can get someone to define the word good for you, you can tell so much about that person and the way they roll. So I think it's such a great question. Good equals God's will. This is kind of like what Caleb was giving us early on in this idea of God's commands are good. If we live up to them, we're a good person. God's prohibitions are evil. And if we fail, so are we. And so good and evil are based upon God's will or God's commandments. Natural law theory is our first hybrid theory in the book, where it combines aspects of divine command theory with more like Kantian ethics, which is based on what is reasonable or rational. And so Thomas Aquinas took human reason and wed it together with God's will to come up with his natural law theory. Utilitarianism is this idea that the greatest good for the greatest number, that is what we should be striving for. It's this collective. What is going to produce the most happiness for the most people? Unlike the egoist who's just concerned about their own, the utilitarian at least is throwing a broader net to include others. Kant, like I previously mentioned, he believed pure reason is what can, or practical reason is what can produce a good or ethical life. Aristotle, one of our big three ancient Greeks, believed it's a well-balanced life. That's how you achieve happiness or goodness. And you achieve balance by avoiding extremes. The extreme of excess on one hand, and deficiency, the extreme of deficiency on the other. So a good life is well proportioned in between those extremes of excess or deprivation. Ethics of care is our most recent of the ethical theories, and it has to do with this idea. It really brings in almost a feminine perspective. All those theories we've had up until this point were all written by and propagated by men. This is our only female-sponsored ethical theory in the book, Ethics of Care, and it's more of a feminine approach, where men might be thinking in terms of things like justice and honor. Women might be thinking more in the terms of mercy and relationship or community. And so I think it's very interesting, and considering our times and our culture, very worthwhile talking about. Existential ethics, that has to do with the experience-based. And I did throw in a couple Eastern ones. Taoism is like following the natural way. That's how you have a happy life. If you go against the way of nature, it's going to be like butting your head against the wall. So instead of doing this, go around, find ways to flow. And then
like feng shui and stuff.
Yes, that would all be tied into Taoism, looking for that natural harmony. And then contemporary of Lao Tzu, who was gave us the Tao Te Ching in Taoism, was Kung Fu Sei, who in the West we call Confucius. And in Confucianist ethics, it's more like etiquette, like how to live in harmony with other people. Lao Tzu in Taoism is more interested in harmony with nature, but Confucius was focused on harmony with others and how to live in society. Any comments, questions on that? All right. I'm going to take just a quick break, and I will be back with you shortly. I just need a minute.
So how's everybody doing?
Right. Oh, did I just pause the sharing, not the video? Still learning. I know it's going to get old. All right. Any questions, comments on any of that? All right. Now we're going to break down normative ethics into 3 or 4 broader categories. The first I want to talk about is teleological ethics. So metaethics, normative ethics, and now we got under normative, we have teleological. Comes from the Greek word teleos, which means end or design or purpose. And so teleological ethical theories are looking at the end, the outcomes of what happens. The biggest ones we have are utilitarianism, also known as consequentialism. And it's a great name for it because it's the consequences of your actions which determine if it's right or wrong. Not the intention, not the execution, but what are the final results. The next major field is called deontological ethical theories. And this is where it's not the outcomes that are primary, but rather the intention and how one acts. Not the results, but your approach and intention to those results. So this is duty-based. You do what's right because it's right, not because you believe it's going to produce a better outcome. And these would involve many of our like divine command and reason-based ethical theories would fall under deontological ethics. The next major category is virtue ethics. And this isn't about outcomes or even intention, but rather it has to do with the character of the person. And Aristotle is probably the big notable champion of this type of ethical theory. And it reminds me a lot of kind of like Jesus talking about how a good tree bears good fruit and a corrupt tree bears corrupt fruit. So Aristotle's idea was we can actually habituate or teach people how to be ethical. And an ethical person is going to be ethical in whatever sort of environment you put them in. So we don't have to worry about teaching them what to do in a bunch of different situations. We simply need to teach them to be good people because good people do good things. And so that's kind of a nutshell of virtue-based ethics. And then finally, I have this hybrid that I'm calling existential or postmodern ethics. And the reason I included this is because I think probably for most of you, you're going to see aspects of all 3 of those, teleological, deontological, and virtue ethics that you like. And in the past, if you're in this like either or false dichotomy or trichotomy, where it's like, no, you have to choose one and the others are wrong, in more of this postmodern thinking, it's like, well, why can't we take what we like from virtue ethics and what we like from deontology and what we like from teleological theories and combine them into our own personal kind of hybrid theory? And that's exactly, for like the first 10 years I taught this class, that's exactly what I was doing. I didn't agree with any of the theories that I was aware of completely, but there were like little bits and pieces of each one that I liked and I wanted to incorporate into my own life, into my own personal ethic. I kind of call it like the California cuisine of ethics, kind of like a Cobb salad or chef salad or like a California roll or something, where it's like fusion, where I took bits and pieces of disparate things and put them together into something new. Now, I have changed my view on that since then, but that's kind of what I was doing for like that first decade I was teaching this class, until one day I realized that there was a really big problem between the way I was doing ethics and the way I believed that I was right and good and holy before God. And so part 2 of the book is I'm going to try to reconcile that. Okay. Questions, comments? Okay, let me tell you a little story to try to bring this home. So I'll stop sharing this now. Let me see what's next. Okay. And then we go into the theories right after that. Okay, so here's a little story to help bring this home. You got a bus driver in San Francisco, and he's got his kids and he's on his way to school, but every day he likes to stop at this coffee shop and get a coffee and a donut. And so he parks the bus on this hill in San Francisco, runs in to get his donut and coffee, and horror upon horror, to Tim, the teleological ethical theorist, he sees the bus start to slip and head down the hill. And he can see down the steep hill, it's going to cross a busy intersection and then go through a park that's full of like ducks and old people feeding them breadcrumbs. And then there's the bay that the bus is going to roll into. And Tim, the teleological ethical theorist, thinks, oh, this is going to be bad. But then out of the corner of his eye, he notices that the Channel 8 news team has a van down in the park interviewing the old people feeding the ducks. And all of a sudden he's thinking, hey, you know what? This could be really good for me and for my family and my career. And so he runs down the hill, is able to get in the bus before it gets to the intersection, weave it through the cars, avoid the old people and the ducks, and bring it to a skidding stop before it goes into the bay. And he gets his 15 minutes of fame. And see, a teleological ethical theorist is going to say, Tim was a good guy, even though his intention had nothing to do with saving others, the children in his bus, the ducks, or the old people. It was just about his own egotistical desire for fame. The end results of his egotistical craving still resulted in multiple lives saved, both human and avian. And so the teleological ethical theorist is going to say Tim's actions were good. All right. Another day, same bus, same hill, same coffee shop, different bus driver. And now we have Dan, the deontological ethical theorist. And Dan goes in to get his coffee and donut with the bus parked precariously. Same thing happens. But when Dan comes out, he's not thinking about news crews and his own ego or any of that. He's just thinking, I've got to save the life of these kids. That's the right thing to do. Unfortunately, Dan isn't quite as coordinated as Tim. And instead of avoiding cars in the intersection, he ends up hitting multiple vehicles and not only runs over the ducks, but the old women feeding them, and the bus ends up going into the bay and people drowned. Now, see, for a deontological ethical theorist, they would still say Tim was a good person, did a good act, even though it ended poorly, because Dan had good intentions and right motivations for what he did. The teleological people were saying, not only was what Tim did bad, but it was even worse than if he would have done nothing at all. I mean, he exacerbated the problem by getting involved, and the end results were many lives lost. And then finally, if we get to the virtue ethicist, and we have Victor, the virtue ethicist, in the same scenario, and he comes out, he's not worried about the end results. He's not worried about his own ego. He's not even worried about like intention or duty. Victor is simply going to do what Victor does. And if Victor is a saver of lives and defender of the innocent and ducks by the bay, then that's what Victor's going to do, because he's responding out of his self, his own character. If he doesn't care about people and ducks and traffic collisions, he's not going to do it because it's really not about him or any of that. So you could have the same scenario with 3 different types of people all approaching it differently. And they are not only going to evaluate the others based upon their own theory of right conduct, but that theory is going to affect the way that they react, the way we live, and the way we judge others. And then the hybrid piece might be someone who likes yeah, we want to save the ducks and the kids and the people. We also want to have good intention about it, not some craven desire for fame, but because it's the right thing to do as a human, they're part of our species. And we would hope our character was sound enough that that's the kind of person we are. Someone that cares about others, not someone that just cares about themselves. Is that helpful? Or did that just make a mess of things? Okay. Any comments or questions on that part? I'm going to do egoism the next time we're together. Don't forget to take quiz 1 by Sunday, midnight, 11:59 p.m. And then by next weekend, you'll have the egoism quiz and your own personal ethic. And there should be prompts there for you to follow if you don't know where to start. Okay.
Are we on campus next week?
Oh, wow. Yes. I'm going to have to mentally prepare for this. I haven't been back in a while. And I may need one of you or 2 of you to help me work the technology, because there's no way I'm going to be able to be teaching in class and monitoring my computer screen at the same time. So I may just ask one of you to sit at the class computer to let me know if any of the people that are doing it virtually have questions or comments or something. I'll try to get there early because I haven't taught this dual way yet. I taught all last semester virtually once they had us come off campus in March, I think it was. Thank you, Dominique. That was completely off my radar. I'm going to have to make sure I know how to use the new technology they've set up. I think they have a camera set up as well for the lecture, like a plug-in camera. So you're not just using the camera on the laptops. Do any of you know?
They usually do. They usually have like one of the stand-up balls.
Okay. So I might need help orientating myself there if any of you want to show up early and help your old prof out.
One of my classes actually meets at the flight school, and so it doesn't end until 12:15. So I should be able to make it on time, but
all right.
give me grace with a minute or 2.
Flip in quietly. All right. Well, in that case, that is good. We will start with egoism on Tuesday and on campus, Lord willing. And for those of you that got permission to do this virtually, or you can't make it for whatever reason, I will try to continue live streaming. And you do already have the pre-recorded lectures or something if you need the information. Okay. All right, I'll linger a bit.